The title of the program is Restoring Forests, Restoring Communities. And we had a little bit of a discussion yesterday at the plenary about the importance of not only thinking in terms of forest restoration, but community restoration. And so we're going to be talking a little bit today about what we might mean by that, what you might think that means, and your ideas about the role, the significance of community restoration, as well as in the pursuit of forest restoration. And it could be kind of an interesting idea. And at C4, I'm from C4, my name is Stephen Lowry. We've been thinking about this role of community leadership, engagement, rights, and how they can contribute to, at the local level, of course, the development of balanced ecological and social benefits and relationships. Just excuse me a minute as I get back on my view. And we've got a great panel today of leading scholars and researchers and leading practitioners and implementers representing the scholarly community, the research community, international NGO community, and national government. So we've got, I think, the right people in the mix, at least from people who approach these issues from maybe the above question, but who are very deeply concerned about the role of local communities in taking ownership, some measure of ownership in restoration. So the subtitle of our event today is How Secure Tenure Rights Help Communities in Africa Restore Forests and Build Local Economies. Forest landscape restoration is not new, but global and national commitments, such as the Bond Challenge and AFR 100, and the urgency of addressing climate change mean that a qualitatively different approach is needed if we're going to achieve the kind of success that we aspire to. Research, considerable research, in fact, identifies secure tenure as a necessary condition, not always sufficient condition, but a necessary condition for successful community forestry, including for FLR adoption. Indigenous peoples and local communities occupy some 50% of the total land area in the tropics, but only have legal rights to a very small portion of those resources, including forests and pastures. Secure tenure, we've come to learn, motivates investments in land, including in community investments in forest landscape restoration. FLR practices that enhance both environmental and social outcomes are more likely to be taken up by local people who have sufficient control over forests and trees to reap benefits of sustainable investments. Simply put, the future of forest landscape restoration is limited if we do not solve the tenure problem where the problem exists. I don't think we want to suggest that tenure security is necessarily a universal constraint, but we find that it's a constraint in many settings. Why is it not a constraint in some settings? Because people have secure tenure. There are contexts where there is sufficient tenure security. The importance of indigenous and community tenure rights is now commonly and widely accepted, but governments still struggle with how to understand and secure customary rights. Customary rights typically don't exist in statute. They're not statutorily recognized in many countries. Ghana is an exception. Ghana's customary tenure regime system is constitutionally recognized and protected. So that's sort of an interesting model to refer to, among others. Furthermore, secure tenure alone is not enough to guarantee sustainability or improve livelihoods. There is an urgent need to address intersectorial coordination, conflicting central and subnational government priorities, and tensions or contradictions between customary and formal systems. In addition, top-down initiatives, and we can say that there are aspects of FLR that originated in the UN, the North. We talked about this yesterday. Top-down initiatives sometimes have difficulty addressing the specificity of local context. The world is complicated. every context differs in various ways, sometimes in significant ways. And practitioners may underestimate the challenges faced by local people and often propose solutions that might not be viable. Okay. This is the need for this mutual learning that's also been discussed at this meeting. Arguably, what might be needed are new models of collaboration between local communities and restoration initiatives, capable of significantly scaling up impact for restoration and livelihoods, which I think is what everyone wants. Empowered and engaged local people will build a foundation for secure tenure and catalyze change. So our panel today will identify and reflect on approaches, incentives, tools needed, actually currently used, and others needed for different actors to support, implement, and scale up forest landscape restoration or ecosystem restoration generally, because this applies to the decade for ecosystem restoration as well. We will focus on the roles of tenure security, local governance, and linking restoration to promotion of local livelihoods, among other topics. Some of the questions our panelists will reflect on include: how do customary tenure systems articulate with state systems of law and tenure? What investments can trigger a new dynamic such that FLR and tenure security are mutually reinforcing and support livelihood development? What behavioral changes and capacities are needed from local authorities, government, and CSOs? Okay. Global attention to both FLR and forest tenure reforms suggests the urgency of finding appropriate approaches to catalyze positive, lasting outcomes. Okay. So let me tell you about the order and sort of the organization order of our presentation. And I've just made a last-minute change, colleagues, in consultation with one of our presenters. So what we're going to do is we have 4 speakers, and we're going to group them in 2 groups of 2. And so Chris Buss from IUCN will start out with a sort of a general overview of FLR, including governance issues and some of the work IUCN is doing. And then he'll be followed by Patrick Rajatsan from Madagascar, who will present research he and his team at the University of Antananarivo have been doing on questions of tenure and the relationship between customary tenure and state relationships. Okay. Then we're going to have a discussion after the first 2 presentations, because we want to have you engage early in the discussion, and we don't want to wait till the end when there's 10 minutes left. Okay. And so we're going to have 10 minutes each from Chris and Patrick, and then we're going to have a 15-minute discussion. Then we're going to have a presentation by Priscilla Wananara from ICRAF, who's based in Nairobi and has been doing research in Tanzania on incentives affecting FLR. What sort of incentives do people respond to? What are the origins of these incentives, local incentives, external incentives, and what that means potentially in terms of FLR investments from different kinds of actors. Okay. And then she'll be followed by Tango Tumeo of Malawi, who is with the senior official in the Malawi Forest Department and the FLR focal point for Malawi. And we're really pleased that she could join us as well. And she'll be speaking from the perspective of a government policymaker and implementer in terms of how Malawi engages with local communities, including around questions of rights and leadership. And so what I want to do is ask, and let me just, before we begin, I'm going to ask all the participants to come to the stage, but first I want to introduce them one by one. Okay. So Chris Buss, who many of you may know, is director of IUCN's Forest Conservation Program based in Gland, Switzerland. Chris is director. This program is responsible, is centered on 3 mutually supporting themes of forest landscape restoration, primary and intact forest landscapes, and locally controlled forests. Chris has over 25 years of experience in a range of natural resource management and rural livelihood programs, and has had long-term assignments in Botswana, Tanzania, and Malawi. Okay. So Chris, please come up. Then Patrick is a professor at the University of Antananarivo's Forestry School. He is a social specialist with social scientist with research interests in local resources management, tenure rights, and how to improve national forest policy from the perspectives of rural people. Current and recent projects include studies of forest landscape restoration and land tenure and governance in east central and northwestern Madagascar, and the impacts of human migration on land use change in forest frontiers. Patrick, please come up. And then Priscilla is a postdoc fellow at the World Agroforestry Center, ICRAF, Nairobi. Priscilla is she holds a PhD in agricultural economics. Her current work is mainly on land restoration, the economics of tree commodities and ecosystem services within tree commodities. She's recently been leading research in Sanyanga region of Tanzania on incentives and disincentives that influence outcomes of FLR. And then finally, Tangu is a forester by profession and a leading FLR expert who appreciates the importance of managing trees and forests as part of an ecosystem for increased and multiple benefits to communities. In her role as Malawi's Forest Landscape Restoration Focal Point, she facilitated the National Forest Landscape Restoration Opportunities Assessment and Implementation Strategy developed in 2017. Okay. Tango, I should also note, is the coordinator of the Malawi Youth Forest Restoration Program, a 5-year, $7 million US government-funded project, which is working with young people on the restoration of degraded areas within their communities. So great. So let me now invite Chris to come up and provide us with a bit of an overview. Thank
you. You got the slides to put up? Just, no, it's the other one. Second one. Yeah, great. That's it. Well, good morning. And Stephen, thank you for the introduction, and thank you for the panel for what should be a very interesting discussion. I'm going to give a bit of an overview on forest landscape restoration and local forest governance, and the work that we do as IUCN, and try and set it in the framing for the research that has been done over the last by our panelists. So first of all, I think one of the important things when we talk about forest landscape restoration is that we build on a lot of the lessons that we've learned. We've been doing community-based forest management for over 30 years. And I think as the forest landscape restoration approach has evolved over the last 10, 15 years, we've had a tendency to forget, actually we've got a suite of lessons that we've learned in that's supporting both forest activities and both agricultural activities. And this is really essential for us to make sure that we're learning those lessons, and we build on those lessons rather than creating anything new. I think too often we think that forest landscape restoration is a thing. It's not, it's an approach. It's with a suite of different interventions of natural resource, natural regeneration, of woodlots, of agroforestry systems. And we've been doing all of that. We've been doing a lot of that for 30, 40 years. But what the forest landscape restoration approach is looking at is how does it come together? How do we look at the dynamics of different land uses? How do we look at how different forestry interventions actually work together? So we're not just doing monoculture, eucalyptus plantations. We're not just doing agroforestry. We're looking at all those different systems of how they work together. So I've just got a few slides here just to talk about some of those issues of the principles of forest landscape restoration, and then of the restoration opportunities assessment methodology, and then how we're using different tools at IUCN to go through some of those processes. Forest landscape restoration, what I've done in this slide is I've highlighted a few critical components of what I see as some of the issues that we need to think about when we talk about local governance at landscape level, when we're talking about restoring landscapes, restoring communities. And I think that the biggest word up there to me is landscapes. So what does this word landscape mean? Too often we put a fence around it and say, right, this is our landscape that we work in. But you, me, we all have different landscapes. So when you're in a landscape, if you're a water manager, you're in charge of a watershed, you're responsible for a watershed, your landscape is completely different to a small-scale farmer who's looking at the productivity of his land. And so therefore, when we're talking about a landscape, it's essential that you're making sure that you have the right people integrated into the processes of identifying the different interventions, depending on what we're trying to achieve at that landscape level. And to me, one of the best ways of that being described is we've done a lot of work in Tanzania, where we have a large program for Sustain, which is looking at better land management, better water management, and how do we integrate more sustainable business practices into that landscape. We've got a landscape governance project ongoing there, and we're working with the private sector, also understanding restoration opportunities. And the critical thing is how we get the right people around the table, how do we look at those landscapes, but also how do we define that landscape. And the director of the National Land Use Planning Commission, I think, I always use it, and apologies for those people who have heard me mention this before, because I think it's such a good terminology of how we describe landscapes. So he describes in Tanzania, through the National Land Use Planning Commission, the legal construct is that land use planning process at national level, regional level, local level. But the landscape approach is the social construct around that. It's getting people together around those issues and defining those issues. So when you are looking at different issues, you're really understanding who's involved. And I was just recently in Tanzania, and one of the things that jumped out to me was that we were talking about the water flows in Kilombero Valley, where we work with a Kilombero sugar company, who's obviously very reliant on the water sources. And we were in Kilombero district, and after a day and a half, someone put their hand up and said, yeah, we keep talking about water flows. Can we work outside of Kilombero district, because the water flow comes from other districts? And that was really interesting to me, because that issue was, we were trying to define the landscape by a district, or it was being defined as a district, whereas actually the issues were going much further. So you needed to bring in actors, you need to bring in the different land actors from the other districts when you're talking about specific issues, when you are restoring functionality, and what's the landscape around those functionalities. So what I've just done here is I think we must be so critical about ourselves and challenge ourselves, what do we define about that landscape? And then we get the stakeholders, then we respond to local conditions. And when we've got that, when we're working on that, we can look at the local social economic context of what we're working within, and then adapt accordingly. I think we think we're going to create a landscape, and we're going to create this nirvana, and it's going to be perfectly okay. But it's not, it's going to change. Markets are going to change, people are going to change, populations are going to change, and therefore the landscape is going to change. So we constantly need to have adaptive management and people involved in that. So I think it's when we're working through the forest landscape restoration approach, I think there's two critical things of remembering the lessons learned. I think C4 in particular have done a suite of work over many years on their RED Plus work, on the community-based forest management work. How does that work together? How do we learn our lessons from that? How do we integrate that into our work? But also understanding what the landscape approach means. And if we're talking about the social construct of the landscape, that means we must be critical of addressing all the governance issues, whether it be tenure, whether it be rights, whether it be decision making. So when we've actually assessed over 600 million hectares in over 40 countries now, and doing a restoration opportunities assessment methodology, Rome. And you know, if you look at those principles of forest landscape restoration, through my next two slides is what it's demonstrating is that a lot of those contexts must still be considered when we're thinking about local governance. When you're defining the problem, when you're engaging with key partners, when you're identifying the specific outputs, the geographical scope of the assessment, and then what are the potential interventions, and how you're going to monitor that. If you look at this preparation of what is needed when you're starting to assess and starting to understand what the area, the interventions, etc., it's really, they're really mirroring the principles of forest landscape restoration and understanding what those principles of landscape restoration are. And it's the same with once you get into the analysis. So the preparation is really setting the scene. It's working with key stakeholders. It's working with key actors to set the framework, and then it's working through the analysis. This is where you get into the depth of the process of working with different stakeholders, of understanding where what the national priorities are. What is the governance framework? So what is the legal, institutional, the policy framework? Not just at national level, not just at regional level or district level. What's the local conditions as well? And what's the scope and availability of land? What are the issues that need to be addressed if you're looking at different interventions? So it's all very well and good saying, right, we're going to do this intervention, we're going to do that intervention, but what is underpinning that, and how do you actually ensure long-term viability? When I was working in Malawi, and it might have been even before your time, Tangu, it was there, around Blantyre, there was a fuelwood project, and the project planted millions of trees around the city of Blantyre. And it was excellent, it was very successful for 3 years until the trees got to a decent size. And then actually all the local chiefs said, right, well, these are all our trees, we're going to harvest them now. And then there was the local communities, probably a lot of women who had actually planted those trees, in conflict with the local authorities, with the chiefs, because they hadn't addressed the tenure issues. So whilst over the case of 3 or 4 years, it looked very successful, post that we hadn't addressed the critical issues and the trees were cut down. And therefore, it was very unsuccessful. So we might look at it, but the tenure issues hadn't been addressed. And so really understanding the scope and availability and the tenure rights of the land is critical in addressing that. And then obviously then looking at the drivers, the benefits coming from restoration, and the capacity and the stakeholders. And I think when we look at stakeholders, I think there's 2 different levels. If you're looking at the local context, there's the overall framing and overall understanding and assessment process, but also one of the things we've done through our land use dialogue is taking it to another issue of level of looking at specific issues as well. So there's an overall broad group of stakeholders who are looking at the landscape, but then when you're looking at specific interventions, who are the right critical people? Sometimes too often when we have people around the table, we say that they're representing various groups. Well, are they actually representing various groups? And I think it's critical to get the stakeholders to understand, or are they just there as an individual, but really focusing on the context and what they're trying to achieve. Yeah, I'm on my last slide, Stephen. So one of the things that we're working on now as IUC, and over the last 5 or 6 years, we've been developing a natural resource governance framework. And this is a tool that has 2 utilities. It can provide specific input to doing assessments on the ground, and actually in Tanzania we've used it on the ground to really understand some of the local issues, some of the governance issues around multiple, whether it be inclusivity, whether it includes decision making, accountability, etc. And that the other use is then an assessment framework to look at your outcomes. And we actually used it as a publication that's just being brought out about everyone's landscape. And what we did after working on 2 RED Plus projects, we used that framework to understand what the outcomes were of that project. It helped us understand that some of the outcomes were, we needed to focus on, and under some of the RED Plus work was how do we get the marginalised groups to not just understand their rights, but have rights. How do we transfer responsibility? What's the role of local institutions? What's the role of local language essential in those different countries? Because we were working in Guatemala, Tanzania, Ghana, Uganda, Peru, Indonesia and Cameroon. So there's a suite of different countries, and how do you get that information down to local people? So this publication is also part of demonstrating how we use this tool to to then assess some of the outcomes of the restoration process. So when we've done a roam, that doesn't mean we're getting all the answers. For example, an initial screening we did was, how do we use tools such as this? It's not just promoting this tool, it's also saying there are other tools that look at it. So when you've got the Rwanda FLR strategy or the Malawi FLR strategy, actually applying and reading through that with using a lens like the National Resource Governance Framework has allowed us to say, well then there are these gaps. And these are the different things that we need to do. We need to address tenure. We need to ensure local decision making, and these are some of the critical groups. If these are your national priorities and these are your national interventions, who do we need to have around the table? Who do we need to be involved? How are they making their decision process? So as you go through from the process of instigating a restoration assessment through to the results aren't just a book that says, right, this is what we're going to do. You need to be applying assessment governance processes all the way through. So you understand that what needs to be done from a governance perspective. So that was just an overall framework of how as IUCN work, but obviously we work a lot with our partners in country. We've done a lot of work with C4 in countries and understanding what's the role of governance. And if I was to finish off of walking off the stage now, I would say what's the most critical thing is really understanding that the landscape approach is this social construct. And as you go through all the different the principles of FLR, the approach of the preparation, the analysis, the governance is at the heart of all of those, making sure you get the right people, making sure you're addressing the right governance context, and making sure we're looking back and learning from the work that we've done previously. So that's an overview of our approach, and I'm really looking forward to getting into some more specifics from the in-depth from whether it be Madagascar or Malawi. So thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm Patrick from University of Tana, Madagascar. I think social construct, as Christer said, is a key word to make the transition towards what I'm going to tell you about, because it highlights the importance, the very high importance of local community. And I'm asking the question about how local community are actually dealt with, taken into account in local decision making regarding forest landscape restoration initiatives. I'm talking about invisible communities because my statement is that community is always there, whatever the form, but most of the time, or sometimes at least, people have a tendency not to see them, to overlook them, like government agencies, or even sometimes NGOs projects, and even sometimes its own members are not aware of the importance of their community. What the point is? Next slide. Okay. So let me make a point on the fact that this study was possible thanks to GIZ, which asked C4 to make a study on their sites in order to improve their approach and their intervention in terms of improving local tenure security for better implementation of forest landscape restoration. And this research was conducted by C4 and ESA, which is the forestry department of University of Tana. So my presentation will go into we have three steps. First step is I'm going to try to show you how communities really playing at local level in terms of land tenure, of rights allocation, of land use rights allocation, etc. Then I'll move to the level of government, of state, to show you how the government doesn't take in account, at least, the government doesn't, there's still a gap between public policies and laws and what happens actually on the ground. And then, of course, the last step will be recommendations for how to do things better. Okay, so this research took place in the Point region on the map over there, northwest of Madagascar. And if you have a walk, if you have a ride through this region, you'd see that we have several kinds of land use units you can meet. So the predominant land use unit you can see there are savanna with more or less trees. Sometimes it is the tree density is so high that it looks like forests. Then we also meet other land use units such as agricultural land, especially for paddy rice field. And there are also other important common resources such as marshlands, raffia stands, etc. And about now for the population and for the human settlements and the human condition, we inside the Point region, which is a very large region, we have very contrasting situations. We have places where very contrasting situation according to population density, linked with migration, according to social homogeneity, and also access to infrastructures. So all those factors, so population density, migration, etc., all together shape the land use patterns and the demand for land, which sometimes takes the form of very hard competition. But what is interesting is, previous one. Okay, so what is interesting is whatever the context. So we have very dense population or very low density population, for example. We always see the community in local tenure transactions. So I will give 2 or 3 concrete examples. Here you see you see this paper which results from a decision made by local community members to give individual members of the community the right to access and to use the land for paddy rice field. That happened in 2005 in this specific case, and in that time, the individuals asked the community the right to transform the marshland into paddy rice fields, and the community gathered. Then they wrote this paper, and at the end, all the community representatives did sign, and thereafter, also the representative of the state signed the paper and stamped it with his red stamp, which is very important. Then, 15 years later, so in 2019, because of starting conflict between those individuals who were granted the right to use the land, then the community decided to forbid land sales. So you see the importance of this community who took the decision to first give the land for individual use, and then after 15 years, they come back and say, no, you can't sell. This is very important. Second thing, which is also very important, is that when we talk about community here, it's not about tribal community. It's not, we don't have strong traditional leaders. But this is a community which is a blend of, you see the intervention of the very local representative of the state. So this is a mixture. This is not a very traditional community. Next slide. Okay. Here's another example. So quickly, this is what we could call the local land registration system. it's not expensive, it's not difficult to get this thing. If one individual wants his land to be registered at local level, then he has to go to the Fuktan, which is the local representative of the state. Thereafter, this latter calls the elders for consultation, and he also calls the other people, like the owners of the neighboring parcels, for a discussion. And once they've checked that there's no conflict, there's no encroachment, then finally they will write this notebook. So this is a simple notebook which is bought on the market, a normal notebook, and they would write in this book the name of the owner, the name of the neighbors, etc., etc., and everybody signs, including the mayor and the president of the Fuktan, which is the local state. Where am I supposed to go? Okay. Now we. Where am I supposed to? So the most important in terms of lessons is that if we really want to look at the community, and if we look carefully, we will always find the community, even though this community is not very strong, sometimes it's not very visible. And this community, again, is a blend of customs and statutory laws, a blend of formal and informal. And finally, community doesn't exclude individual ownership. This is also very important, because sometimes we have a tendency to think that community means common and no individual rights. So the next slide. Was it two? Yeah. Problem is I can't make it move. Oh. Okay, so now what happens at the state level? There is actually some efforts, real efforts to recognize local communities. So these we can see through different laws, a new law recognizing the right for community to manage natural resources, or the land policy reform, through which we see that before this land policy reform, people had to go very long distances to access the Office of Land Service, or any land that didn't have a title was regarded as belonging to the state. But now it's not the case anymore, so those are true improvements. But looking at the table before, please. But looking at, when we look at the real implementation of those laws, which are supposed to, which recognize local communities, they don't actually, there is still a large gap between those laws and local practices. So finally, local practices remain the most effective and the most legitimate rules and practices in terms of land security. So if this is the case, what happens is statutory law is the exception. Customary law is the rule, but we need to preach both. That's the main problem. So my last slide is to say, okay, so this is the case, then what are we supposed to do? So what we are supposed to do is very simple. We need first to understand the community, how they work, how they play, how they perform at local level. Based on that, then we can recognize them and improve things. And my last point would be improving and strengthening communities doesn't mean that we strengthen communities to the detriment of the state. It's not the point. The point is we want to have strong community, and also the state would interact with the community and with also other actors so that things move further. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Chris, for these two very interesting presentations. I think Chris helped us understand, he made a very clear point that we need to think of landscapes as social constructs, that the Rome methodology is very explicit of taking account of, or attempting to take account of, not only biophysical factors associated with restoration, but governance, tenure, finance, market, the economics of restoration. And it provides a framework. It really kind of requires the NGO or the government or local people to consider all of these issues holistically. You just don't pick one that you're good at. You sort of have to look at the whole package. That's heavy lifting. That's hard work. It requires capacity. And then Patrick has this really interesting metaphor, really, or idea of the invisible community. And it's invisible in law. I mean, they exist, but often not recognized in law, statutorily, of having a particular organizational kind of character, or having particular rights to land and natural resources. And he described a very intriguing, interesting kind of sort of adaptation by communities, a group in northwest Madagascar that wanted to manage some resources collectively and worked with the state authority, the local state authority, to get their validation for what they were proposing to do. And that gave some credibility to, at least to a certain degree, to the local initiatives. However, it's not the kind of solution that one would aspire to. I hope these are all fair summaries, but let me now open up the floor to questions and comments from the audience. We have set aside 15 minutes for that. Yes, sir, if you can give your name and your association. Yeah.
Right. My name is Mohammed Falaki. I'm from Nigeria, the Society of Landscape Architects of Nigeria. Well, I really find the second presentation quite interesting. In Nigeria, the Land Use Act actually gives the state the complete right to possession of land, and communities only have the right to compensation. Interestingly, in 2 weeks, I'm supposed to interact with the local community that the government is bringing in a renewable energy facility. There's supposed to take a last piece of land for that facility. And interestingly, there is a river that's passing the community with the forest and what have you. Now, in Nigeria, the community is only entitled to compensation, however it comes. So reaching that balance of that facility that's been brought up to compensate the community doesn't necessarily care about the forest unless it is actually supporting their livelihood. So in a situation like that, it's two ways. There's compensating the community on one hand, then compensating the environment on the other hand in terms of restoration. How do you bring about the balance?
Big three comments or questions. Let's see, the gentleman here in the back. You want to hear from a lady as well? Can we have others want to raise their hands? Okay. Go ahead, sir. Go ahead. Give us your name.
I have a question, well, it's a comment actually. One of the fundamental things I continue to see with community forest restoration or community forest landscape restoration is a question of what type of rights do they have? There's a lot of talk about devolution of rights. There's a lot of talk about tenure rights, but we hear very little of political rights. This is a situation I have seen that these communities want to conserve an area. Their area is well delineated, but the government will give that area for some logging permits, or a mining concession just right next to them. They understand the principles of conservation. They understand how to protect trees and how to nurture them. The question of how do they defend their tenure right is always not discussed. So how do they actually get that political power to be able to secure their tenure rights and use it to acquire other rights? I normally see the conversation around landscape restoration just around conservation context. And it's unfortunate, but we can see it within the totality of community development. Natural resource is just one aspect of the challenge of communities. Natural resource is a means for them to develop all their potential, social, political, economic development. It comes within that whole space. And then we're using landscape restoration or forest natural resource management to achieve that. But once we limit our conversation around natural resources management to just conservation, and we don't look at the other possible areas, we're actually limiting them. We're not giving them the full range of power that they're supposed to. Just one last comment. I'm doing some graduate research work focusing on devolution of power in community resource management areas in Ghana. One of the biggest challenges I'm seeing is the question of devolution. The government devolves power to them. That power is not recognized by the local institutions. Even the terms of the devolution is not quite clear. So just a comment I'm throwing to you, it may come as a comment, it may come as a question you may answer. What do we mean by tenure? What is the place of political rights? When we talk about devolution, what is the kind of devolution that really works? Thank you.
Those are great questions. Thank you. Another, Stuart? And then we'll, yeah, if you could, Mark, then we'll have another round after that.
Thanks, Stephen. I really liked Patrick's example of the Cahier Tello, I think it was called. I thought it was really interesting, and it actually brought to mind an issue about approaches to addressing issues of rights and tenure, and actually very much with the last speaker as well, where you've got devolution, but devolution without any authority, that it's a transfer of responsibility, right. But without any benefits or without any rights. I remember actually working with an Australian anthropologist, Bob Fisher, several years ago, and Bob used to stress that one of the problems with lack of defined rights and tenure was that it inhibited communities and individuals from taking decisions. They didn't know if they would, as we know here in Ghana with tree tenure issues, you didn't know if someone was going to come in with a D8 bulldozer and fell a doom standing on your land and then move off. So I think one of the interesting things is, do we always need to really aim for the highest level of tenurial reform that's embedded in law and regulatory, or can we find interesting workarounds? It's not saying that it's one's to be traded off against another, but if we keep pushing against the hardest entry point, are there opportunities? And I think that this is sort of the lesson I got from the Cahier Tello, that there are other ways of actually doing that gives that degree of confidence and stability for communities, for individuals, to be able to get on, invest in their land, and receive benefits from it.
Great, okay. So, Stuart, Patrick, we have three questions. One from a colleague from Nigeria related to the state ownership. There's some entitlement to compensation. That's a tricky question. What's fair, what's not? Question of balance. And then this questions from our friend in the back with respect to the sort of the content of rights. And he noted that, yeah, if communities, they have the right to conserve, often, to a standards perhaps set by the forestry department, but use rights are kind of another question. And maybe that's been my experience, that you can have certain rights, you can help us with conservation, but in terms of using the resource, your rights may be very limited, and other rights may be limited. And so getting that kind of, what's the appropriate level of rights, this sort of comes to Stuart's comment here. Do we have to have highly formalized rights in statute, or can we have something else? And he made reference to Patrick's. Patrick, you want to start?
Okay. I'm going to try to answer, though I'm not sure I got all the questions very well. So please, in case I didn't get them, elicit a little bit more. But about the question, I think your question about why the paradox is that local community, local people not necessarily care about resources, right? So how to deal with that? I totally agree with you. To me, this is just a belief, not just belief. Surely there are some evidences somewhere else in the earth, but in Madagascar as well, people often don't care about sustainability, don't care about forests. We have exceptions, but this is the reason why I was saying that. So it's not about, the point is not about strengthening communities to the detriment of the state or other actors. Because, as you say, if you leave just the local community to deal with the resources, especially if there are people doing slash and burn agriculture, for example, the forest will be finished very, very rapidly. So we can't just expect people to get their rights and then to deal in a sustainable way with their resources. This is obvious to me. So precisely what to do, I don't know, but the most important is that we need to find this balance. So if it's not local community who bring this idea of sustainability, then it has to be whether the government or partners such as NGOs, etc. I believe that. The types of rights. Okay, so that's a good question, because I really wanted to have more about that, but given the limited time, I couldn't. What is, I think, very important is that local community has sometimes management rights or alienation rights. As we saw in the example, it's at 15 years ago, for looking at the first example I gave. So in 2005, the community granted the right for individual ownership. In this paper that the community signed, the individual people who benefited from this convention, let's say so, were allowed clearly to go for the land certificate, which is, regarding the state laws, which gives the private ownership right. But 15 years later, we saw that the community decided to forbid the land sales. Normally, the community, no one should be able to do that, because once you have the land certificate, then you normally are the owner, the private owner, and you can sell the land whenever you want to. So I think this is the most important thing we need to have in mind, that this community might have different type of rights depending on what is ongoing on the ground. And the other question, if we go further in this direction, is that it's not obvious that local community is always, how to say that? No, I would say that we need to be careful when trying to understand and to know better the community. We need to understand very well which kind of resources they are dealing with currently. Because in Madagascar, for example, on the eastern coast of Madagascar, we have it's not actually traditional leaders, but those are people who are the mediator between people and their ancestors. So those people have nothing to do with forest or natural resource management. But what you often read, even in scientific papers, is that people would say, okay, we need to take those people in account because they are the leaders. No, they are just dealing with social aspects, with social life, not with the use of natural resources. And maybe for the last point, I think, and this is related to the first question, I think I'm convinced that we can't again leave the community alone and hope that they will do their best for sustainability, etc., etc. But we do need a general framework, and this is the role of whether the central government or at least the regional level. But we do need this framework, framework. Otherwise, I think things might go worse. Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. Would you like to?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. I think that the two questions and then Stuart's response, I think, are very clear in local specific cases. So you've got to have strategies that respond to that. Actually, Stuart's not presenting an IUCN position, but I've actually made the similar notes of actually the comments and notes that I'd made is formal versus informal governance, and what is good enough governance. I think we can wait till we get the perfect governance systems, but can we wait that long? So I think we have to really understand what is the good enough governance to get us moving. If you look back, we understand what the issues are. We know what what needs to be addressed, and we also know how long that takes, and we also know the political context between traditional and between customary issues, etc. So how do we broach that to advance different types of interventions? And Patrick, I think, and you came to a really interesting point of how people actually address this. Yesterday we heard and the role of local institutions. Yesterday there was a session on Kramers in Ghana, and it was fascinating to hear from those people involved in Kramers how they are now managing their land, not just from forestry interventions, but having an influence on land use actions that are actually degrading their landscapes as well. So looking at it from a positive but also negative, and how they're coming in, they take on a real responsibility to do that. But also likewise, how are groups involved in the understanding where the restoration opportunities are? Yeah, perhaps when you're doing the Rome process, it's to help set the policy and programmatic framework, looking at the opportunities. But the further we go down onto the ground and into planning and into different interventions, we need to be working at different levels to understand what are the governance issues that we need to address. What are the formal, what are the informal, what is good enough governance to make things happen? And that scale drifts down, and you can't just make decisions at a national level. One of the Rome processes that was undertaken recently, in the report there was 15% government, there was 10% NGOs, there was another 20% governance, there was one community traditional leader who was involved, who actually had a role, who was actually involved in, had a dual role as a traditional leader, but also worked for the district authorities. So where was the community in helping develop and understand those? And I think where we are in 2019 to be letting those processes still happen when you're not involving communities, you're not addressing governance issues, even though it's at a national process, is actually still quite shocking. That we actually allow those things to happen and drive where we're making, not decisions, but we're setting a framework, and we're developing incentives, and to understand what happens, and the fact that we still have run processes that have just no representation is quite shocking.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Now we'll move on to our next round of presentations in the interest of time. And so, Priscilla, if you please come up.
The back presentation, please. Okay, as it loads, I'll be speaking about incentives for forest landscape restoration based on the work we did in Shinyanga in Tanzania, and it's work with my colleagues at World Agroforestry Center, ICRAF. So I'll just start with the history of the Shinyanga land restoration in Tanzania. Land degradation in the Shinyanga region started as early as the 1930s, and this was brought about by different factors, among them the need to clear forests to get rid of flies and scare wildlife away, and also overstocking, and also demand for wood and fuel. And also insecure tenure rights within this region also propelled degradation, and this happened from the 1930s to the 1940s. The 1960s and 70s, again, the cash crops, mainly cotton and tobacco in the area, also intensified this degradation. And by the 1980s, this region had turned into some sort of an arid area, and that's when the government of Tanzania, around 1986, together with ICRAF, came up with this restoration project, which was commonly known as HASHI, which in Swahili means Hifadhi Ardhi Shinyanga, a direct translation to Conservation Initiative in Shinyanga, and it was funded by NORAD. And this project ran between 1986 to 2004, and this led to establishment of restoration areas in this land, and commonly referred to as Ngitilis. That is the Sukuma language. That is the name for restoration areas that they gave these restorations. And these were both privately established as well as communally established Ngitilis. And this has been successful. Even after the project ended, the local community took over the management of these Ngitilis under the leadership of the village government, and also there was some involvement of the government through the government body called NAFRAC. And this has been going on well until recently, as recent as 2017, 2018, where there was a directive that came from top to move some of the communally managed Ngitili to the state, and that has brought a lot of conflict, and there's all these ownership doubts that are clouding now the management of the restoration areas in this region. And those are just examples of the restored area. The below picture is what Shinyanga looked like before the restoration, and those are pictures we took last year when we did this study, which has been really successful. It's a form of an agroforestry restoration where you have fodder and trees, and that has been successful. And that's when we thought to understand what drove the success of this restoration in this particular region. And as I said, we studied Shinyanga, which is in northern Tanzania. We conducted focus groups in 14 villages distributed across 5 districts, covering 2 very diverse agroecological zones. And the restoration involved different actors. It was not the success of one particular actor. We had the village government, the local communities, civil society organizations, NGOs, and all of them worked together. These are just a Venn diagram showing interactions between these actors. And as you can see, there's much overlap between these actors, which means there was a lot of connectivities, and also the larger the circle shows the more power that the actor had. And what was cross-cutting for most of the villages was that the community was the main actor that had a lot of the power, together with the village governments, and all other organizations, they came to support the restoration in that area. And then moving on, we had the looking at different we looked at different governance attributes, and of the 6 attributes we looked at, the most important attribute that led to success in this area was respect for local knowledge and involvement of local people, which we found really interesting. And all other attributes were as important but not as strong as that one. And then we asked about the incentives. Sorry, it's misbehaving. We asked about the incentives that were really key in this area, and the strongest incentives that came from all the villages were conservation benefits, that they can derive direct benefits from these gitilis was a key motivation to continue with them. Then they had these penalties, quotas, and permits, which were set by this village government, sort of by laws, and also they acted to motivate or discourage the destruction of these ngitilis. We had education and information that they were informed of this. Then there was Red Plus, which is actually the pay cash for carbon sequestered, which was a pilot project which ran for a really short time, and it was also some sort of an incentive. Property rights and increasing land prices was also mentioned, and awards that they received. Moving on, as I said, the conservation benefits. Some of the conservation benefits they drew from this came from some were economic, ecological, and also cultural, such as preservation of their indigenous tree. That came out very strongly as one of the incentives, and also social ones, such as reduced conflicts between pastoralists and farmers. That was also a key incentive. And as I said, red was there, but it was a pilot for a really short time between 2010 and 2013. When it started, it was a key incentive, but over time, because of the discontinuation, it led to a lot of disappointment among the local community, so it was not such a strong incentive as the other ones, such as conservation benefits and so on. And moving on, again, property rights and increasing land prices. I have to say, land in Tanzania is state-owned, but it's managed by individual households and also communities. And the need to strengthen these rights was a key motivation to setting up the restoration areas, because they thought if we put trees on land, that will mean they own the land and the land rights get strengthened. And also increasing land prices because of greening of the landscape has also been an incentive over time. And also over time there's increasing land pressure because of population growth, and people feel there's the need to move this to the next step of registering these land rights, because that's the only way they can secure the benefits that have grown over time from this successful restoration. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the need to move the directive to move the management from communally owned to state has brought a lot of friction, and there's all these ownership doubts that are clouding the restoration efforts that have been going on over time. And again, they feel like if they register the land rights, then probably that will be sorted out. And again, this just shows what worked, what did not work, and the lessons, which I already mentioned in my previous slides. And then in summary, what from the lessons we drew is that intrinsic incentives, these are things like conservation benefits and understanding the need for restoration, which are incentives that come more from self-desire than from external factors such as the Red Plus, were more successful and were more preferred, and they are more long-term than these other, which we call the extrinsic incentives. And also cash-based incentives such as Red Plus and other payment for ecosystem services, they need to be well thought out, and they need careful deployment if they're to be successful incentives. Otherwise, they resort to what we call, they become perverse incentives, which do the opposite of what we want the incentives to do. And then finally is that moving on, is that incentives and disincentives, they don't work in isolation. They work hand in hand. You cannot say, I will just do a Red Plus in this area. You have to put there are synergies in different incentives. And another thing is that participation, equity, and local knowledge and institutions, they are needed if the incentives are to work. And finally, the issue of governance is, the closer the governance system is to the local community, the more successful it will be in the incentives and also in landscape restoration. And yeah, that is it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As Stephen mentioned, I'm Tangu Tumeo and I'm coming from Malawi. I'm the focal point on FR 100. To start with, I've been asked to respond to two questions. The first one is asking whether our programs are adapting to the diversity of land uses, governance, and tenure context across the country. And the second question that I'll be sharing with you on is concerning the degree at which Malawi Forestry Department, where I'm working, see tenure security as a factor in successful implementation of FLR. To respond to the first question, I'll start by sharing that Malawi did an assessment of opportunities for restoration in 2016 using the methodology that Chris presented. So we have a report that tells us where the degradation is, to what extent, and in short, we know by now that over close to 80% of the country is said to be degraded. So that presents opportunities for restoration through various interventions. And after we did that, we developed a national strategy to implement interventions that will help us restore the degradation that was identified. We got support from WRI, IUCN, the US government for us to do this work. But to put it more into context, let me mention the fact that Malawi is an agro-based economy. Over 80% of us depend on farming, which is not even commercial, but subsistence. So you can consider now the demand that is put on land for us to sustain ourselves. So the aim for restoration is short for us is we want to ensure that we are transforming landscapes at the same time transforming livelihoods. Because we need, until we get that balance, we are not going to go very far. These interventions that are put in our strategy, they are not new. We're talking about conservation agriculture, we're talking about farm managed natural regeneration, we're talking about tree planting in areas that have no trees. But if you go around and look at what has been happening despite these technologies being introduced in these communities for so long, the adoption is not there. We are not upscaling these technologies to restore the landscapes, despite the fact that we have degraded lands. So what is going on? We noticed that we might have been weighing more on the environmental outcomes, but not really looking at the socio-economic outcomes. So until we get that balance, we might not be able to achieve much. So moving on forward, that's what we want to do. The bottom up, top, up, top, bottom approach, those can come together to make sure that we improve how we do business. The other crucial part of that as well is landscape level planning. We talk about all levels of stakeholders. We have farmers, we have traditional leaders, we have government, we have NGOs, we have donor partners, everybody that has an interest in these landscapes. They all have to come together. Let us all identify our roles and responsibilities. For government, we have to create the enabling environment for farmers and communities and NGOs and everybody else that is going to implement forest and landscape restoration to be able to do that, to help the communities, for us to achieve the goals that we want to achieve. Because otherwise, until we talk to each other, until we understand each other's needs, until we are able to learn from each other, we might not be able to move forward. I like our colleagues in red, their t-shirts are saying, empowering local communities for the change that we need. For change that matters, I think that's very true. Because communities have been implementing their own restoration activities over years. We have science now that can be complementary to that, but local communities have to be in the forefront because they are the ones that are going to make the final decision on whether to restore or not. That we have seen across that. Projects can come with money, but as long as the communities are not part of that process, the communities are not buying into that, then we might not move any further. So to end with that question, I would say we have to ensure that every voice counts. So there's a private sector that can come and provide jobs to communities while restoring land. There are communities that have to be taken into account. There are traditional leaders. In Africa, traditional leaders' voices make more sense to communities, or they are more powerful than any other voice that can come along. So recognizing the role that traditional authorities have within communities is also going to be very important in our programs. And in the various projects that we are developing, we have 5 now, specifically on FLR, we are ensuring that the landscape level planning is involving every stakeholder that has a direct interest or even an indirect interest on the land to ensure that we move together and we achieve our goals. The second question is asking to what degree does Malawi's Forestry Department see tenure security as a factor in successful implementation of FLR? We have a Land Act now that's going to be implemented, that's going to give rights to landowners across the country, including local communities. But until we get there, government still has the rights to almost all the land in Malawi. And one other component that has to be mentioned is culture. In Malawi, women don't own land. So, and the youth will have to inherit it from their fathers, of course. But the largest population are women. So how do you empower communities? Because the community includes the men, the women, and the youth. How do you empower communities to a point where they all feel ownership of the land? Because that will motivate people to implement activities. I'll give you an example. We have a tradition where if a man, in some cultures, when a man marries a woman, the man moves and lives in the woman's community. He feels that he doesn't belong, because if the marriage ends, they will tell him, go back to your village. So in his mind, he's thinking, I can't make any permanent investment in this village, because if the marriage ends, then I'll be chased. I don't want anything here. Those are the realities that are happening on the ground. How do we incentivize long-term landscape restoration to such groups of people? Because as long as he feels like he doesn't belong in this community, he's not going to plant a tree from which he will benefit from in 100 years. He will not be here. So how we have to, as we are developing our programs, we are making sure that they are locally driven as much as possible to understand the context, because otherwise, if we overlook some of these things that look like they are minor, but are going to be very crucial in the end in terms of how we make progress. Chris mentioned an example of a tree planting program that came planted trees, not thinking about who owns the land on which the trees have been planted. Yes, there is no tree standing now. There is no eucalyptus. There is no one single tree that is standing now because of such conflicts. So overlooking such important issues should not be done as we move on to ensure that we maintain the progress that we're making. So as recent as last week, we did a mapping across the country, which is supposed to be our baseline for implementation of forest and landscape restoration, where we found out that we have over 3.2 million hectares of farm-managed natural regeneration across the country. We didn't know that until now. So there is a lot that is happening. And this has not come only because of projects. This is what communities have been doing. So there is something that is happening. Science can always complement what has already been happening to ensure that we make better progress. So in short, I would like to agree with our colleagues in red that yes, the baseline is empowering local communities, understanding the community dynamics, understanding the governance structures that are already existing on the ground, understanding the land use challenges that they have, and meeting them in the middle to say, okay, we have this problem, we have this solution, how can we come together? Because each one of us have ways, and we have been doing this over years, and there's nothing new that we're doing now. We just want to make sure that there is lasting progress and lasting impact from all our initiatives. Let me stop there for now. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks to Priscilla and Tengu, two very interesting discussions on Tanzania and Malawi, respectively. I found the Shinyanga case very interesting in terms of the initial success through kind of a multi-stakeholder initiative with strong focus on community engagement, collaboration between communities and the government, NGOs, and with some strongly positive results, it appeared. And then it was sort of interesting and a bit troubling to hear that there's now questions in the air about the actual ability of the communities to retain the kind of tenure rights that they've had that's contributed to the success of the outcome. So there's some important, thank you for sharing that, because and I can imagine there's discussion and debate going on in Tanzania now around next steps. But this is where I think research can really provide tremendous insights into what kinds of incentives and disincentives are effective in achieving the kinds of outcomes we all want to achieve. And thanks so much. Your observation on gender and women's rights in the customary tenure system are very important. And this is not an unusual situation around the world, actually. But we do see contexts where well, I worked in Lesotho for some time years ago, and there, because of the recognized importance of women in local governance, partly due to the outmigration of men out of the country for work, the customary system came to recognize women's rights and as being equal, that they could inherit, in other words, in ways that had not been previously possible. So there is potential in some contexts for adaptation, in others not so much. So it's a very, very, very vital issue. In the case that was shared earlier by Chris about the failure to really recognize the rights of women who were benefiting probably from firewood and other non-timber forest products from the forests around Lilongwe or Blantyre is a very important lesson. Very important lesson. Okay, well, let's open it up for comment and discussion, and focusing on these last two presentations. Show of hands. We have one. We're going to take 3 questions. Okay. So yes, please, Leo. Yeah. Please give your name and
Okay.
organization.
Thank you very much. My name is Leo from Uganda. 3 issues. And the first one is, do rights guarantee the benefits to our communities? We are talking about rights. So I would want to learn whether absolutely rights can guarantee the benefits that motivate communities that sustain the landscape restoration interventions. And secondly, the state laws for land ownership, and on the other side, the land use, which is a right. For now, we may not know, we may not go whether to determine whether land ownership is a right compared to the land use. But what is popularly known, land use is the right. So, from the presentations, we would be focusing on the land use right that generates benefits, because the ownership is that either I acquired the land, I bought it, or I was born and found that my father owned it, or my culture, and then I acquired it. But moving forward, we need to separate these 2 principles, land ownership and land use, that translates into transformation. Then the last issue is about,
Okay.
thank you, the last,
Can we keep it to 2 so we can enable others to ask?
about the community rights. Community rights and community resources. Within the community, there are resources which are public, that are used by everyone, and then there are those which are owned by individuals. So we should be looking at the public resources. What public resources are we talking about to enhance restoration of the landscape? Thank you.
Thank you. important questions. Other questions? Yes, sir. Please give your name. And
Thank you. My name is Hayford, DGM Ghana. Listening to the last speaker and linking it to the second speaker, that is the invisible communities. It rings one bell, like one thing comes to mind. You realize that you are even tempted to want to ask the question if really communities exist. And bordering on most of the comment that is coming from the grounds, you realize that something is amiss. I mean, something is missing. Actually, do we really have the communities? Yes, we do have them, but they tend not to be seen. Now, my question is this. Is it that somebody is creating the cover-up of communities, or sort of somebody is trying to hide the communities, or it is the communities that is hiding itself? That is my question.
that's okay. Great question. Are communities being hidden, or are communities hiding themselves? Very interesting. Do we have one more question this round? Okay. Sir?
I'm Nava Jonathan, and I work for Create Ghana. Create is really working to restore especially degraded lands in the northern part of Ghana. We are working in Burkina, Mali, Niger, and also Ethiopia. And we are supporting rural poor, especially women and the youth, to harvest from trees and develop value chains for them, and to use the power of trees to fight poverty and protect the environment. Here is the case. We are really supporting the resource poor people, like the women and the youth, who really have no control over land. And from the presentation from Patrick, I would like to know, probably if I didn't listen well, what challenges they faced in trying to create opportunity for people really to have access to land, especially the women and the youth. Because I believe that we don't own land, we only have control over the land. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, let's then have comments initially from Priscilla and Tangu, and then there was a question directed to Patrick from the last speaker. So please, yeah.
Okay. Okay, I'll address the question from Uganda, whether rights guarantee benefits to a community. Okay, rights do not guarantee they secure the benefits, such as even if you don't own the land, you don't have the certificate of ownership, but you can use the land, you can still access the benefits, but are they secure? It can easily be taken away from you. There can be changes, and then the benefits are not secured. And then the other issue of land ownership versus land use, it actually ties again the same. Land ownership, you cannot, okay, in some cases you cannot even sell the land. You don't have the certificate of ownership. I'll give you a case where I come from. I come from Kenya. Kenya, we have this, the land ownership also ties to the individuals, to the communities. Like if I own land, I have the certificate of ownership, what we call the title deed, and I can do whatever I want to do with it. I can sell it to anybody. In that case, the rights are secured. in other cases where it's owned by the state, but like in Tanzania, it's owned by the state, but the households and community can use the land. That means they can only use it, they can farm it, they can give it to their dependents and such things, inheritance. But again, the state controls. Like in what I was saying, the case of Tanzania, where the state can easily take the communal restoration areas because the land in Tanzania is state-owned. There is no law that prohibits the state from taking it, while if it is secured in terms of certificate, it will not. In Kenya, that cannot happen, but in Tanzania, it can. Yeah.
So, to add to what Priscilla has said, talking about rights, I will mainly focus on the benefits part, because for us in the Department of Forestry, we manage government forest reserves, and in our policy we talk about participatory forest management. So the land is owned by government, but communities still benefits from the fact that they are living close to these forest areas. So there will be various activities that they will be undertaking. So as long, it doesn't matter that they don't own rights to the land, they are not owners of the forest reserve, but the communities still benefit. So that's what we have to ensure in whatever we're doing, to say, we are employees, but these local communities live with that forest, live near those resources. So we have to ensure that they are getting benefits from managing those resources as they are near them. There was a question on what public resources are we talking about to enhance restoration. So we can talk about money, for example, funding. Government's role is to mobilize resources to ensure that communities have access to finances that they need to implement restoration activities. We talk about technologies that have to be, awareness on such technologies that have to be brought to the communities. That requires resources. Communities will require resources for them to implement restoration activities. Not only that, but we're also, the same way, looking at the resources that natural resources that they are around them. Government has to ensure that there is policy. For example, communities have access to national parks, communities have access to game reserves, so that it's not only for tourism purposes, but the communities that are living around these resources are also benefiting. There was a question, where is the community in all this? Mm-hmm. I think on our part as the Department of Forestry, we have realized that we had that problem. We didn't recognize the role of the community for so long, and we've lost the battle. Talk about us planting 60 million trees every year that you don't see. People have commented to say we should have trees on roofs now. If you're planting 60 million trees every day, where are they? So this is a government-driven initiative, plant. But we're not asking communities what trees you want, for what purpose, and where are we planting this tree. So we've recognized that it's without the community at the heart of what we're doing, we are not going to move very far. And we are changing that using this approach where we're saying every interested stakeholder has to have a voice. Let's bring everybody to the table. The women will have certain specific tree species for medicinal purposes that they know. They want those trees to come back because we've degraded all that. The men have specific timber trees that they know that when they have to make tables out of, it's much easier to process. We need to bring back that, and we have to tailor our interventions to specific communities because culturally we're different. There are 16 million of us in Malawi. There are 14 dominant tribes that do things differently. So we have to understand, put into context, what are their needs, and move together, because otherwise we're just putting money down the drain, and communities I know don't appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, well, I'd love to add in, but I think it's just really fantastic point of how many trees we've planted and how many actually we have existing. It's a great point for us all to take home. But I also I think you're being both Priscilla and yourself, Steve, are being very casual about your last point about the government wanting to take back the trees in Shinyanga. Actually, we as IUCN use Shinyanga as one of the great examples of restoration. And if we turn around and see that the land or the trees are being then taken, and the different ownership systems or use rights are being either taken away or different being put in place. I mean, this is just goes beyond just troubling. It goes beyond the heart of what we're actually trying to achieve. So even if we get the right trees in the right conditions, and it still has the power to take it away, then it's a massive issue. We were doing some work on protected areas categories 5 and 6, which is looking at much more, the village forest areas, the community forest management, etc. And the first thing we did in the development of that project was getting feedback from the communities that it's not a protected area. As soon as that word protected area is used, they think they're going to lose the land. They're not again seeing themselves as actually having an area where they have rights to use it, and they have rights to manage that land and extract from that land, from that forest. They just see it as it's something they're going to lose. So I think we need to move the rhetoric from troubling to very concerning, and going beyond that.
It's very important. And is it to this point, sir? Yes. Okay, great. Please, and give us your name, please.
My name is Kwame Usu. I work with Tropimbos Ghana. The last point that was made by, I've forgotten your name, the screen speaker, is interesting because Grace also mentioned functionality as part of the assessment. And I see that linking the two speakers, the last two speakers, that is something that we often overlook from the beginning, because if you are talking about functionality, then you can also talk about benefits, and usually you find local actors looking at what they can benefit from the restoration projects that you are embarking on. So for example, if you go to the share landscape in northern Ghana, people are interested in having share baka. If you go to Amarula landscapes, you find people interested in restoring that, because that is at the core of their livelihoods. Recently, I was working for a different organization, and we wanted people to restore trees in cocoa landscapes. And interestingly, people began to talk about something that has already been lost, which is chewing stick. And when we look for chewing stick seedlings, as soon as we get to the community, people were just coming for it, and we had a shortage. So it taught me a lesson that indeed, if you do a preliminary assessment well, you get people buying into the idea, getting what they want to really get from the landscape project. If you overlook that, then we might not be even starting well. And that also takes us to the point of, are we investing more into local knowledge, which was mentioned by Priscilla? Are we looking at the species that people use locally, but we don't have enough ecological knowledge or ecological knowledge on them? And that has been the case with rosewood in Ghana. At a point, it was just charcoal. Nobody knew it was a valuable tree for timber. And now we have a big problem with it, and we are unable to really regenerate it to the level that we may want. So research, what are we doing in terms of local knowledge? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Great. Patrick, there's a comment from someone over here that regarding the social women and youth.
Okay,
and
so
how they're
I'm very
benefiting.
happy to comment on this link between ownership and benefits. It's true. I mean, you said we only have control on land, we don't own land. Maybe my answer is very contextual, but I would just say that my point is, and I'm sure about that in Madagascar anyway, but I think also in many countries, local tenure systems are secure, but this is not private ownership. And even private ownership, when it comes, might create conflicts. So in the cases I was talking about, we have the case of marshlands, the case of raffia stands, which used to be the place where people go for fishing. It is open, anybody can go there as soon as they're living in the villages around. So what's happening nowadays is that some very influential individuals, local elites, are trying to ask to claim this land for their own private ownership. So local community is complaining because they've lost the right of fishing, they've lost the right of harvesting raffia fibers, and they have even lost the right of access. They can't even access the neighborhood, close to the thing. So now, I think this is a very important point, that you don't necessarily need private ownership in the sense of legal rights to be able to benefit something. And everything is like that, I think, most of the rural areas. And my last point would be about women. Where are women in this table? We have, maybe this is very particular even in Madagascar, but in our study cases, we have very dynamic women association. And what is very, to me, amazing is that those women, normally, traditionally, women are never written on the land certificate. It's always on the name of the man, member of the family, the sibling. So what the tendency in this area now is women are now, they have required to be on the land certificate, and they are now. So they took the certificates from their brothers, from their fathers, and they said, please, let's rewrite this thing. And they did that. And that doesn't mean that they have private ownership, because this land still remains under family control, the extended family. Those women, it's not because they are written on the certificate that they have the right, for instance, to save land. No, but still, since they got the right to be written, if we could say so, on the land certificate, then they have started, they are happy to grow lemon trees, etc. And they have, this is something concrete. It's not like, you know, so they have started, it's very small, a very small scale, but they have started to grow banana, to grow lemon. They have harvested first fruits, and they are selling first fruit on local markets, which are very, very small markets, but this is very positive. Thank you.
Okay. Chris?
Yeah, can I add into that, because I think, Patrick, I think you emphasised a really important point, and it goes back to that formal versus informal, and what is good governance. And actually, I think that's the trait running through it. I always hate using European examples, but coming from England, actually, you'd be surprised how such a high percentage of people don't own the land. There's actually in the property rights in England, there's what's called a freehold, which is someone owns that land, and then there's a leasehold, which actually someone rents that property. It's on long-term conditions, and it's a long-term framing, but it works, and people have therefore their rights to invest, etc. And it's not in such a complex situation as where you've got customary regulatory rights and different land conditions like as you have in Africa. So it's really focusing on what actually works and what actually gives people the right to the right of ownership, the value behind that. So it doesn't have to be direct ownership. It can be long-term renting over 100, 200 years that then gives those people rights to be able to extend that. So it really is making sure we don't get hooked up on the wrong thing if we just say, well, we must own the land.
That's right.
I mean, but you know, what are the conditions that you want to invest in that land is two different questions. I think in Ghana, you know, with the lack of land ownership, people also, you can own the land. I think not quite sure, but then when the trees are planted, you don't actually own the trees. You know, so we have different conditions and different situations in each country, but what is going to make it work?
Great. Any, do our esteemed panelists have any other comments they want to offer? We're good? Okay.
There was a question on what are we doing on local knowledge. Do we have any research on that? I think for us, we are incorporating that now as part of our programs, because we want to encourage the regeneration of indigenous tree species. So we are incorporating that in the programs that we have developed to ensure that we keep stock of what was there and what people would want to restore back. But the challenge that we're having now is the fact that the demand for energy, wood biomass, is high, and people we are running the risk of trying to bring in exotic species that will grow fast and provide the firewood fast. But we're looking into that to make sure that we don't lose on the indigenous as we're trying to supply the energy needs of the communities.
Yeah. Great. Well, with that comment, I'd like to thank everyone for joining the session, for staying into the coffee break. There's a little bit of time left. And I want to thank the panelists who I think brought tremendous experience and insight and knowledge, including some considerable local knowledge to the discussion. And thank you all for your questions and for your attention. Thank you very much.